Shabbat Shalom, folks. Glad to have a number of you sticking around after a wonderful morning and a wonderful Devar Torah from Dr. Lila, Corwin, Berman. I know a number of you are also joining us on the live stream, so welcome as well. I am not going to introduce our speaker, but I'm going to mention how delighted I have been not only to work with Melissa Geer as the chair of our newly reinvigorated continuing ed committee, but also a wonderful group of committee members who are devoted to Jewish education and to Beth Am's role as a learning community, as we've been very much since our inception. And so I would at this time like to call on Zach Berger, one of the members of our continuing ed committee, to introduce our speaker.
So this week's Parsha presents at least two stories that confront the ideologic bases of society with what actually happens materially. And in her very erudite and eloquent Devar Torah this morning, Professor Lila Berman presented us with a dialectic that compared these stories to the relationships between the American Jewish community and the African American community. And in a similar way, but on a different topic, last night she talked to us about anti-Semitism and how the stories that American Jews tell about themselves and about their experience in the Golden Medina, the Golden Land of the United States, are thrown, or a different light is shed on them by the actual material and structural circumstances of American Jewish history and American history. So it comes as no surprise to learn that what she is doing as a very renowned and accomplished American Jewish historian is to shed light on the stories that American Jews tell about themselves, and doing that in a dialectical way. I'm not going to call her a Hegelian, but telling about what stories mean and what stories people tell about themselves is a very historical thing to do and a very Jewish thing to do. And so Professor Berman is an American Jewish historian, and she is, I should mention, because she's about to talk about philanthropy, the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University, and she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. So she's in Philadelphia, so please pretend like I just made a joke about the Eagles and the Ravens, because that's basically all I can do. And her new book is The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Million-Dollar Institution, and she's going to talk to us today about how American Jewish philanthropy is the subject of not just the story of American Jews telling themselves, but actually material and social and political circumstances that actually happen to American Jews and Americans in general. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our eloquent and erudite speaker, Professor Lila Berman. Thank you very much.
Zach, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm always delighted when people try to explain what it is that I do and connect all the different pieces. And I think it was helpful for me to hear that you see a through line, because sometimes I feel like I just get interested in something and I follow it. But I actually think you did do a really apt job of describing what connects my interests. And this talk indeed is about materiality. So in the Devar Torah that some of you heard, I explored obviously these ideas of blame and blamelessness, and I sort of briefly, following the philosopher Tewo, suggested that reparative relationships must be situated within questions about the distribution of power. And that's really what I want to drill down into in talking to you today about American philanthropy and American Jewish philanthropy. Really, in my mind, one of the most consequential systems through which Americans, and especially American Jews, have thought about redistributing economic power is philanthropy. Other kinds of philosophies of redistribution have been important, but philanthropy and its particular relationship with taxation have really kind of been at the heart, I would argue, of how Americans think about kind of the right way to redistribute some element of economic power. So what I plan to do in my time with you this afternoon is share a little bit actually about why I decided to study this topic, and then offer kind of a concrete discussion Now, as a disclaimer, I suddenly found tax law so interesting, and I know not everyone shares my passion for it, so I try to rein it in, but I am going to offer sort of what I hope is an interesting but concrete discussion about some of the mechanisms through which the philanthropic system in the United States operates and how it's historically developed by looking at two different important structures of philanthropy. And then I'm going to reflect on, and we'll welcome your thoughts and your input on ways that we could reform what I will present as, I think, some of the real essential shortcomings of the system of philanthropy, if one believes that its aim should be toward a kind of redistributive and reparative vision. So in terms of my own research, one way I try to explain how my research interests relate or cohere is that I think I'm interested in asking what forces have shaped American Jewish politics over time, and I'm particularly drawn to ways that state policies and laws delimit the kinds of choices and opportunities that Jews have had in terms of kind of framing and enacting their politics in the United States. And this is a different way of kind of asking questions about Jewish experience in the United States, which have tended not to really involve questions about state laws and policies. So this has been sort of a field I think I've been interested in developing. So I came to thinking about philanthropy because I was finishing, well, there's two reasons. This is the annoying academic reason. I'll give you the other one too. But I was finishing a book on Detroit that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. And I was looking for a footnote because I wanted to talk about how even as Jews left the city of Detroit, one of the ways they remained really engaged and directed to the city in a way that varied from other white Americans who participated in white flight is they were involved philanthropically. So I had all of this archival evidence to show that this was a relationship that they continued to have with the city, and I thought it accounted for something of their kind of liberalism and not quite following the trend toward conservatism that many white Americans who moved to cities made. So I was just looking for a footnote that said, like, of course it was philanthropy. Philanthropy is really, really important to Jews in the United States. So I did the thing, I'm looking around trying to find, and I find specific studies of individuals, some studies of institutions, but I was looking for that big analysis of this structure of philanthropy and how formative it has been to the shape of Jewish communal life in this country. And I didn't find what I wanted. So it was really at that moment, I just started to kind of brainstorm and think about how would you tell that history? So that was one reason I saw this sort of gap and I wanted to understand it. But the other thing is that as I was searching for this footnote and thinking about it more, I suddenly realized I personally couldn't look in any direction without seeing how my own life was structured by philanthropy, and especially Jewish philanthropy. And yet I had lived till that point, I don't know, this was 10 years ago, so 30 some odd years I had lived without really giving it much thought. And suddenly I was like, the salary I earn, as you just heard, the funds that paid for my graduate education, the scholarships I received to go to Israel, the books that my children were reading, the camps they attended, all of this was imbricated in the system of philanthropy. And I always think that when something feels really natural and inevitable, it's definitely worth kind of stopping and asking some questions about it. And so I realized, I literally tried to make a back of a napkin calculation about how much money had been invested in me. I felt actually sort of guilty after that. But I realized I had some questions about this. How had philanthropy structured not only my life personally, what kinds of choices or opportunities did it give me or not give me, right? What was its logic? How was I imprinted by it? And how had it structured more broadly American Jewish life? And how did this change over time? It just suddenly seemed like this thing that was, just sort of assumed to be out there really needed to be dug into. So I started my work and I did a couple of things. One thing I decided to do with this book, which I had not done with other work so much, is I really just decided to talk to people who worked in some facet of this large universe of Jewish philanthropy. And so I started having all these conversations with different people and just learning a lot. And you'll hear the fruits of one of those conversations in a minute. And I also began to just explore where and when Jewish dollars in the philanthropic system came into contact with public laws and policies and revenue that were defined as safeguarding the public good, right? Like, I really wanted to understand what was it that made this kind of money fall into that rubric of the public good. And so I started reading, things I found fascinating, like bylaws of different organizations and budget reports and correspondence about different kinds of financial policy. And as I did that research, I found two really key trends. The first was that I was able to see a major historical transformation in American Jewish philanthropy, and I think it's true in broader American philanthropy as well, with the rise of kind of importance and significance of endowments, of accumulating money deemed in the interest of the public good, calling it philanthropic, well before it is necessarily fulfilling any particular public good, right? And so we see this, kind of most visibly in universities, right? Huge endowments at universities, they are deemed to be in the public good, and whether or not any particular dollar in that pot is actually fulfilling a particular interest is really irrelevant to its status. And I got really interested in how did Jewish organizations come to embrace endowment, because I learned pretty quickly that many of them, in fact, had rejected endowment, and I'll talk about that a little more. And the other key trend that I saw was the rise of the power of the individual in this system. The individual to designate and to draw certain kinds of benefit from dollars defined as serving the public good. And I also wanted to understand, how did that happen? How did that change over time? In what ways did laws and policies make it so that there were different or more benefits for certain kinds of individuals in this system? And all of these kind of two trends emerged really in particular in clear ways in American Jewish philanthropy when I was studying two structures of American philanthropy that I would argue were sort of advents of 20th century tax policy. So these are the two structures I'm going to talk about. One is called a donor advised fund, and one is a private foundation. I promise I'll make them interesting. So, donor advised fund. 3 words I had never heard together. I did not know what this was, right? This gives you a sense of like how much, and I'm sure I had benefited from money dispersed through donor advised funds. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about it until in one of my conversations with people who were working in Jewish philanthropy, this guy who had been a lawyer in Cleveland and who had been really involved in the Jewish Federation there, said to me, do you know what a donor advised fund is? And I said, no. I'm like Googling while we're talking. I was like, no, I really don't. And he said, well, I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but I'm just going to tell you this. You have to get to know someone named Norman Sugarman. And so I said, oh, can I have his number? No, he's no longer living. Okay, that's okay. I'm a historian. I know how to do this. And I almost immediately learned that this untold character of American Jewish history and the history of American philanthropy was at the forefront of 2 crucial transformations that I had been trying to look into. One was persuading Jewish philanthropic organizations to embrace endowment, and the other was inventing really a novel strategy to allow donors incredible autonomy to determine their philanthropic priorities, so how and when they gave, while gaining significant tax benefits. So he, this guy I was talking to, I don't think knew that these were trends I was trying to understand, but he had the sense that historians of American philanthropy and American Jews had missed the boat because they had never paid attention to this character of a very sort of modest, quiet man named Norman Sugarman. So I did get to know him in the archives. He has a really prolific collection of writings, and the archives of the Cleveland Jewish Federation have some of that, and the American Jewish Historical Society. He was born in Cleveland in 1917. He received his law degree from Case Western Reserve University in 1940, and he was really the one who taught me how to love tax law. And I used to sort of imagine that I was like really studying it under his wings because I was, reading it through his own ways of understanding it. So when he was reading and learning how to apply tax code and thinking about tax law in his training as a lawyer in the late 1930s, the federal income tax was really in its infancy. And maybe this, I think, accounts for his perception that it was a playful thing, right? A malleable thing that could be used in lots of different ways to achieve different societal ends. Some of you may know that until the late 19th century, the United States did not have an income tax. Instead, there were state-level property taxes and some excise taxes, and there really wasn't a means to raise federal revenue, except for sometimes certain wartime mechanisms. And after the Civil War, right, when there's a sort of interest in making a more robust, centralized federal government, and an interest in having that government be able to provision for the needs of more people, the idea of a federal income tax becomes something that Congress thinks about, and in fact, they pass in 1894 a federal income tax that very quickly is struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and it then takes a couple of decades actually to muster the energy and the support to have a congressional amendment, the 16th Amendment, passed in 1913, which gives Congress power to tax income, right? So this, again, is not a history I had thought a huge amount about, but Sugarman helped me appreciate that tax law was really at the very core of the history of philanthropy, but actually of the history of this country, and actually of the history of how a government has the ability to encourage or discourage forms of behavior, right? That this is a kind of lever that can get people to do things. And that to me was really, really interesting, right? Like, and again, here's this thing that, you know, many of us go through our lives. You think about it at various moments or whatever, but like, you're not thinking about how it's sort of intimately involved in who you are and the decisions you might be making. And a key facet of the federal income tax was, in fact, the opposite, the exemption, right? That the government not only could tax, but it could exempt certain forms of income, certain forms of property, or certain kinds of behaviors from taxation. And one Secretary of Treasury called this a tax expenditure, right? That the government could both collect revenue, and that would be one way that it would, like, you know, decide to then distribute that revenue, or it could exempt certain things from taxation, and that was like a subsidy for certain kinds of acts. So like in some of the climate change and Green New Deal policies, when the government is saying, you know, might say, although this didn't quite get through, but, you know, if you do X and Y that we've decided is good for the environment, you can deduct that from your taxes. That, in fact, is the government sort of subsidizing X and Y, because otherwise you would be having to pay taxes on that income. So it's a way, in a sense, of outsourcing to private actors the ability to act for the public good. So all of this kind of context of understanding tax law is then important as Sugarman graduates from law school, and he's immediately hired by the IRS. And he is somebody who's very successful, he's very detail-oriented, good IRS employee. And in the early 1950s, he is asked to appear before Congress to testify about charitable tax law, which is something he'd gotten interested in. And he's actually answering, it's the 1950s. So what is Congress really concerned about then? This is the time of anti-communism and McCarthyism, and a lot of the questions are sort of pointed about what is it with these organizations that are allowed to hold and handle money, and yet we don't have much public oversight of them. You know, is this a place where there might be cells of power that could be very subversive? So there's a kind of concern among some of the folks in Congress that forces undermining American power might actually be subsidized by these kinds of tax exemptions. And Sugarman, kind of under fire, you see him learning to defend the charitable sector, to build a defense for current and the kind of current charitable exemption, and also actually for expanding it. And he says very clearly that the private sector should not be restricted by the legislature unless there's clear and present need. And he develops a sort of defense for the idea that really it is best to leave as much of the provision of the public good to the private sector as possible, and that when private entities are committed to acting for the public good, which should be a broad category, the government should not only get out of the way, but should assist them in that pursuit. right? And so he's developing this kind of case, and he's kind of slapping back Congress and saying, do not even think about changing this charitable tax exemption. You need to do everything in your power to continue to incentivize private individuals and private groups to act charitably, right? So this is the kind of defense he makes. And he then decides to leave the IRS, and he goes into private practice, returns to Cleveland, and he has a tax law practice. And has lots of different clients, but one of his most important ones, and he spends a lot of voluntary energy also working for, is the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, which was one of the older federations, and it was a very well-capitalized one. There was a lot of money in the Cleveland Federation. And he starts to really dig into, like, how do these federation structures work? And are they working the way that they best can take advantage of, not in a malevolent way, but in a kind of salubrious, helpful way, to take advantage of the benefits that the federal government gives? And should anything change? And so he notices that the financial technology of a federation and any kind of umbrella, kind of charitable structure, he believes at that point, is like a revolving door. So as donations come in annually, allocations right away go out, right? Like the money is supposed to come in and then spin out. And this, in fact, was written into the bylaws of federations, right? So if you look at New York City's federation, they have clearly in their bylaws, they start in 1917, and in 1920, the bylaws say only a very small percentage of money can be held in any kind of reserve fund. Money that comes into this federation must be spent. That is why people are giving. And they will give again the next year, and we can count on that because there are urgent needs. Well, Sugarman perceives a flaw in this model, which is he thinks that the revolving door worked well when Jewish communities confronted immediate material needs. So when there were lots of new immigrants coming in who had, lots of different needs that needed to be dealt with immediately, or when it was during the time of the Great Depression, right? When any money that came in was, just absolutely needed to meet urgent needs. But this system was not well designed to address needs of a growingly prosperous American Jewish community, right? And so this is the late 1950s when he's thinking about this, and he notices that there's a kind of inequality that's developed, that the community's resources exceed their immediate needs. However, the future needs, right, which feel unimaginable, right? This is a time when people are talking not only about the consciousness of the Holocaust and what it did to Jewish communities and what that might mean for a Jewish future, but people are worried about assimilation, they're worried about intermarriage, they're worried about like a kind of future that feels so indeterminate and anxious. So those kinds of potential future needs well exceed community resources. So there's this kind of tension. The future feels so incalculable that the community resources that are going above and beyond what could possibly be needed for the immediate needs probably don't even meet half or a third or an eighth or whatever it might be of what the infinite future needs might be. And this is all the more so because starting after World War II, organizations like Jewish federations actually were able to get federal dollars through different social welfare programs to provision a lot of the kind of social welfare things that they had been raising money for, right? So it frees up capital in a sense. And Sugarman's answer, so he's not alone in perceiving this problem, right? That like there seems to be material comfort in the immediate moment, but the future feels really sort of a kind of anxious enterprise, and nobody knows what it will be, and so there's a sense still of scarcity around thinking about the future. His answer is narrow and wonky in a way, but arguably much more consequential than those offered by philosophers or rabbis or anyone else at the time, which he says, we just need to shift the technology of Jewish philanthropy. The financial technology needs to change from a model of capital circulation, which is that revolving door, to one of capital accumulation, endowments. So quick allocations, good for immediate needs, but for the future, we need to allow funds to grow, enriched by public tax subsidies and fueled by investment returns. And he gets to work right away, enacting his answer by using tax law. So in the mid-1960s, Congress is on the brink of like a major tax reform that ends up resulting in the 1969 Tax Reform Act. You might think 1969 was important for other reasons, like Woodstock or whatever. It's important because of the 1969 Tax Reform Act. Congress was reforming the income tax in all sorts of ways. But one of the things it was doing in terms of charitable taxation was trying to define a distinction between private charity and public charity, trying to say that there was a difference when you had an organization like a federation where there's a mass base of donors and there's a kind of public threshold it meets, or a Red Cross or a university. There's a difference between that and the Lila Berman Private Foundation, where I follow my bliss and give money charitably as I might wish. And they say, we think that the Lila Berman Private Foundation, that one needs to be regulated in a different way than the one that has this sort of like broader base and this kind of mass public quality to it. And Sugarman knows they're trying to do this, and he knows that the goal is to put the more sort of draconian regulations on private foundations. And he realizes, and not alone, he's talking to other people who are representing other charitable entities, especially universities and United Ways and such, that the more philanthropic money can be classified as part of those public charities like federations, the more state benefits and freedoms that those philanthropic dollars would receive. So in the late 1960s, he starts writing and drafting pieces that end up being part of the tax reform legislation and end up influencing IRS code to really broadly construe the types of funds that could be classified as part of a public charity, and to justify the preferential treatment that those kinds of funds will get. So the preferences, like that federation as opposed to my foundation, doesn't have spend-out requirements, doesn't have excise taxes on investment earnings, can absorb the transfer of large private foundations into it. So at the same time that he's trying to kind of make a very capacious definition of what might be able to fit under public charity, with his eye on expanding the philanthropic dollars that public charities can hold, he envisions a new philanthropic housing to live within public charities and to accrue the benefits of a public charity. And these become donor-advised funds. So with the passage of the 1969 Tax Reform Act, he creates a test case for something he initially calls a philanthropic fund. This is a fund that is named after an individual, so I could have the Lila Berman Fund. So it's a separately designated account, but it is technically part of a public charity, and it gets the benefits of the public charity. And what Sugarman's brilliance really was realizing that this would be a way that you could grow public charities' endowments and afford individuals more autonomy and control. Because even though ultimately I only have sort of advisory privileges over how to spend that philanthropic money, it is my designated account, and the public charity wants my money to be part of its endowment. And so generally speaking, we'll be pretty amenable to the kinds of recommendations that I give for how this money should be spent. He gets the IRS approval for this, although a lot of people at the time are telling him they will never fall for this. You are just trying to put a private foundation in a public charity, and the IRS is not going to fall for this, but he's very good. He gets the approval, but it's an uphill battle to convince Jewish leaders that they actually want to expand these funds, because they say, we have always had a commitment to making sure that when someone gives money, we can tell them, you're giving this money, it is going to be spent on this. It is needed. We're not just going to sort of pocket it away or silo it away or warehouse it away somewhere. We literally need this money now, and here are the needs, and that's why people give to us. So they kind of almost psychologically can't imagine the case for endowment. And Sugarman starts going on, this is why I get to know him so well, he goes on these speaking tours and he gives these addresses and he has typed scripts of them, and he runs seminars for tax and estate planners, and he writes a whole manual with models of all the different IRS filings that one needs to set these up, and he just sort of like puts a kit together and he presents this over and over and over, and Cleveland is an early adopter of this. And Cleveland is able to show these graphs of how quickly its corpus of holdings is going up. And it doesn't matter that they're not spending it out. It's not fulfilling a particular immediate need, but they're saying that this is a fund that will exist in perpetuity. And what is the concern of American Jews at that moment? That Jewishness exists in perpetuity, that there be continuity, that it survive. Here is this financial way of proving, and to this day it was so fascinating when I talked to, I think he's retired now, but the man who had been the head of Cleveland's Federation, and I said something, Cleveland is not like a really growing Jewish city at this point, and the Federation has a huge endowment. And he said, well, I always think that there might not be even one Jew left in this city, but damn it, we're gonna have a very, very handsome endowment, right? So this idea that that could be a kind of agent of perpetuity. So he is very successful. Endowment size in the general Jewish Federation system overtook annual campaign revenue by the early 1980s. By 2013, a full third of the $16 billion endowment of the Jewish Federation system were held in these funds, in donor-advised funds. But the system moves well beyond Jewish philanthropy, and it becomes a hallmark of American philanthropy as well. Today, there's about $160 billion that are held in these kinds of donor-advised funds, and in the early 1990s, banks like Fidelity and Schwab got charitable status specifically so they could hold these funds. And if you look at the largest charities in the United States, Fidelity actually tends to top the list. And that is because Fidelity is the holder of these kinds of donor-advised funds. So this very technical structure for housing philanthropic dollars was important for two reasons. It increased the power of the individual donor, who was vested with the same authority of the public good as a public charity, and it increased the ability of charitable entities to accumulate capital without binding them to any particular spending logic. So when you have money in a donor-advised fund, you are not under any obligation to spend any percentage of that money on an annual basis. Many do, right? This is not to say people don't, but you're not under obligation. And this had clear ramifications for the communal, political, other forms of power that both individual donors and well-endowed charitable entities could exercise, even without any particular act of actual redistribution, right? And this, to me, was a really important thing to think about, that this money could be put here, could be deemed in the public good without necessarily moving. So the benefits of the donor-advised fund did not convince every donor, however, to put their eggs in that basket. And I want to just briefly talk a little bit about some of what I learned about private family foundations, sort of the other side of this, this kind of model. So even as I think donor-advised funds are incredibly important to American philanthropy and American Jewish philanthropy, private family foundations hold more money than donor-advised funds. Some of the most recent numbers give an indication that around $1.1 trillion of philanthropic assets are in private family foundations, not just family, but private foundations. And if we look at Jewish philanthropy, there were not very many private foundations, and then there was a skyrocketing number that started in the 1990s, right? So there's been a real proliferation of the number of Jewish private foundations. However, as a historian, it's really hard to learn about private foundations. And as a Jewish historian, I think maybe all the more there's certain ways that it's hard, because there's certain information that a private family foundation has to make public, and generally foundations have treated that as the ceiling of transparency. And so when I was doing this research, I knew I wanted to learn more about Jewish private family foundations, and I wanted to try to trace some kind of historic development. And I kept on talking to people who were happy to have conversations with me, but when I said, can I see your papers, can I see your bylaws, no. And they were under no obligation to, and these are not bad people who are necessarily trying to hide something. They just did not prepare themselves or think about what they were doing to have that kind of public face when it came to those sorts of papers. I would tell them, look, you don't have to show me, but have a plan for archiving this stuff, because the projects you fund are only going to have so long of a life. But you will be able to be remembered for how you participated in this larger moment by historians if you archive your stuff. So, I was like trying to tell them at least to do that they can put restrictions or whatever. So at some point, I ended up learning that the Crown Family Foundation, which is an important Chicago foundation, had on staff a dedicated archivist. And I was so elated. I was like, okay, this is good, right? So I get the guy's number, and I have no idea if I'm right, but I sort of imagine, like I call, and he's in this dusty room with like crumbling papers, and it's dark, and the phone rings, and it certainly is one of those like rotary dial phones. And he picks it up, and I'm like, I'm a historian, and I'm wondering, can I see your papers? And like the sun shines in. He's like, this is the moment I've been waiting for. And he was super excited, and he was like, yes, we have papers, and I have them really well organized, and I would love to share them with you. Most of what he does is when the family, this is a huge foundation, and it has multiple generations, and when the family has questions, like, have we ever funded X, Y, or Z, or what was it that my grandfather was doing in 60, whatever, he will help them get their hands on that family history. But he said, I'll go to the family and find out if I can share these documents with you. So that was great. I wrote a formal request. And he comes back and he said, yes, I can share and I'll scan them. However, I have to redact out any financial information. So I made this guy's life hell, because if I had I'd show you a piece of paper, I should have brought one in, pages and pages of all the different bylaws and the minutes from all their meetings, and with these black redaction lines everywhere, meticulously getting rid of any financial figure. Like why they thought if I saw something about how much they gave to some, friends of Tel Aviv University in 1962 or whatever, why they think it would have mattered, I'm not sure. But it just gives you an indication, like, there is a sense that transparency is not necessarily in the interests of this system. So nonetheless, I was able to learn a couple of really interesting things, like in the case of the Crown family, which they created their foundation in 1947. The family had made money by building material supplies, and they got into real estate, as many of these families did. And one of the brothers, so they're immigrant parents from Lithuania, and one of the brothers ended up actually buying the majority share of the Empire State Building in the 1960s. And when he sells it, it's clear that that money is some high portion of it is put into the foundation, right? So I could learn how foundations could be used as a sort of release valve for real estate holdings. And I also saw that when donor-advised funds became possible, the family shifted a fair amount of money into donor-advised funds in the Chicago Federation, and that's where they did a large amount of their giving, and that now the Crown money actually constitutes roughly a third of Chicago Federation's endowment. So is this a public charitable endowment if one family's money sort of constitutes a third of it, is an interesting question. But the other thing that was fascinating is the bylaws provided a window into a kind of generational story about the anxieties that I was talking about Jewish continuity and perpetuity, and how these became implanted in financial rules. So in the 1990s, and right in 1990, I think, they amend their bylaws. And this is no accident, because the sort of founding generation is passing away. And there's anxiety about how the kinds of practices that were just the norms of where money was given, would they endure and what would happen? So one thing they do in 1990 is they mandate that 50% of the grants have to go to Jewish organizations. And that's actually a lot of the money that goes to the Chicago donor-advised funds. But they also redefine decision-making eligibility at that point. And they write that only family members who, quote, have demonstrated his or her Jewish identity through his or her personal religious observance, synagogue membership, organizational affiliation, or in some other manner that shows his or her ties to the Jewish community and to Judaism, can have any say over the money and over the allocations. And they put into place a system where you can essentially rat out your cousin or whatever to say, like, yeah, he's not a member of a synagogue anymore. Or one of the most interesting pieces is if somebody marries a non-Jew. That was used as grounds to say that somebody really should not be able to be a voting member, and that you would report who, quote, does not possess a Jewish identity to the oldest board members. So this was fascinating about the kind of mechanisms of power and control and how that was kind of being like shoehorned into these kinds of, technical bylaws about how this foundation would work. This was reversed in 2009, but it was really a concrete expression for me, and this is where I want to, kind of the last big topic I want to address. It was a concrete expression of how philanthropy can be a kind of reactionary and very conservative expression woven into financial practices of endowment and individual power. And it sort of leads to the question of whether philanthropy is an agent of repair and responsibility or an agent of resistance to repair and responsibility. And I noticed over the course of the research that for all of the aims to move money to solve problems or help those in needs, philanthropy as a system was extraordinarily resistant to scrutiny. Those most vested in its practices, so not just philanthropists, but philanthropic professionals and the massive networks of nonprofits and institutions that are reliant on it, they don't often feel like they have either the leverage or the interest in really asking hard questions about it. And some of them in conversations or in articles that I was able to find or correspondence from the past, some of them quietly recognize the deficiencies of the system, especially around problems of overaccumulation and underdistribution and individual power over decision making. Like, people can be very, very aware of this, but few felt the leverage or saw the benefit in suggesting change or asking big questions about whether this system was really fostering the public good or the social repair that seemingly justified it. And I can talk about this later if there are questions about it, but I was very directly rebuked for my research for sort of poking at the beast at times, and really told that these were simply inappropriate questions to be asking, and that specifically as a Jewish person, to draw any kind of attention to the sort of financial maneuvers or machinations of Jewish philanthropy was inviting anti-Semitism, right? And in many specific ways, I was once directly told that if I didn't have tenure, I would have to be very scared for trying to ask these kinds of questions. So people do take this kind of seriously, that it is a beast not to be poked at. But two questions I want to raise, because I don't stop asking questions, is, really to ask two different questions about how this system works. So how does a system sanctioned and in fact subsidized by the public good, how can that avoid replicating the inequalities and injustices that have disempowered whole swaths of the public? And I think about this in sort of a literal and a figurative way. How is this system an extractive system, even as it is meant to be a system that is sort of redistributing and giving economic power to a broader swath of people? And in a literal way, when we think about the extractive side of philanthropy, we can think about something like the Schusterman Foundation, right, which is out of Oklahoma. Latest data values its assets at $2.2 billion. And this is a Jewish foundation, incredibly important to so many facets of Jewish communal life today, that was capitalized by a family business of natural gas extraction, hydraulic fracturing projects, and offshore drilling. So, for example, insofar as some of these practices have harmed our planet, should the money made from them be expected to serve direct purposes of repair, or should the family have freedom to earmark the dollars as it wishes? Or there's more figurative ways we can think about the extractive properties of philanthropy, asking from what communities and causes has capital been taken in the name of philanthropic decision-making and endowment investing, right? We could think about Sheldon Adelson's philanthropy, which again has been incredibly consequential to American Jewish communal life, which was profit from gambling, right? Profit from certain real estate holdings, recycled into bankrolling programs like Birthright, but also advancing the candidacies of several far-right politicians whose policies measurably hurt poor and underrepresented people. Or we can think of, in a less kind of headline-ish way, the fact that so much of the money of Jewish philanthropy was made through real estate, and that so many of those real estate practices, not because people were necessarily horrible people, but because the structure structure of real estate in this country was invested in profiting from people who were underrepresented, who were poor, who were minorities. That's my first question about how philanthropy replicates or doesn't injustices. And the second question I want to end with is, what responsibility do those of us who are involved with philanthropy, which I think is all of us actually, all Americans, all American Jews, what responsibility do we hold to make philanthropy and perhaps capitalist practices more generally accountable to democracy? And I think this is the one that might be most particular to those of us invested in thriving Jewish communities in the United States. The question of, in order to repair the gross injustices that have allowed for the consolidation of philanthropic fortunes as endowments, how are we going to have to think about our own institutions and values differently? So I hope I made a good case during services that we should not strive for blamelessness, right? And I'm certainly not striving to blame anyone, right? I'm striving to get a conversation going that is informed by history, that is informed by questions that are not about who's to blame and who's not to blame, but is rather about kind of the soggy land that we try to communicate on, where we use lots of different languages and we have gaps and potential misunderstandings, but we still can ask, how can we make it better today? What kind of responsibility must we be willing to take, including perhaps using and thinking about our own money differently? So I'm happy to take questions.
Once again, there's Mike, there's Karen, people bringing it from home, so maybe wait for the mic to come to you, and so that folks can hear the questions and responses.
Well, that was a really fabulous talk, and since I wasn't thinking about where you were going to be heading with the end, I was waiting for the aha moment, which came at the end, which was great. I thought the talk was going to be a little bit, because I just read the headline, about how Jewish philanthropy helps to make America better and how we have a special role in the American community in being in the forefront, as we like to think we were in the civil rights movement. And I realized that it seemed to me that that wasn't the case, that Jewish philanthropy seems to be like every other philanthropy. It's sort of ethics neutral. It depends on the people who are directing it. And it occurred to me that creating an endowment of X billions or X trillions of dollars to use for some future purpose when things are falling apart now doesn't seem like a very admirable way of building for the future, when there won't be a future if we don't change what's happening in our country at present. So I don't know if that was, you're a historian, so you're supposed to have an objectivity that I don't have the burden of having, but did you have that feeling when you went through this process that, you know, like, what was it, Togo said, you look in the mirror to look at the enemy, you know, and we're the enemy? Was that one of your conclusions, or?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I do want to say is that, you know, whether in the archives or just in meeting people, like, one cannot help but be struck also by phenomenal acts of generosity, right? I mean, it is the case that people can make lots of different decisions with how they spend their money, and you could always buy another yacht, right? Or you can fund a cancer research center, right? Like, so this is not to undermine the fact that in the particularities, one can be motivated by incredibly altruistic and ethical kinds of principles. And, you know, kind of like my lens on this is to ask, okay, but like, what are the broader structures that make it so that whatever that generosity may or may not be, it's also part of a kind of system that is actually kind of pulling away the possibility for accountability. It's pulling away the possibility for a broad public to be engaged with determining what the public good is. And in its kind of sense of justification by some future point, it is actually allowing for an incredible sort of amassment of resources in much the same way that we see sort of the inequality gap increasing in our country. And I did think about the words of Julius Rosenwald, who, another Chicago person, who was one of the heads of Sears Roebuck, and he became very involved in philanthropy, and he very specifically had a kind of mandate that no philanthropic dollar should be around that he gives 25 years in the future. It needed to be spent. And he said the future generations will take care of the future generations. And who are we to presume that we know what the future needs? And I thought about this, I'll end here. I was on some kind of program that the Jewish Funders Network was leading about something called the Jewish Futures Pledge, where you can pledge to leave X percentage of your estate to Jewish and Israel-related causes. And one of the women, a very wealthy person who had helped create this pledge, said, I do it because I see my kids, I don't know if they're gonna have a strong Jewish identity, and I want them to know that they wanna fund helping the whales in the future. No problem, they are going to fund the Jewish whales. Right? And this sort of sense of like, what, and what Rosenwald would say is like, okay, trying for immortality doesn't work, right? And that was something that, was really interested in thinking about how this system works.
Yeah, so thanks. That was really interesting. And I have to say, as somebody who's spent a career attending legal theory workshops, that was one of the best ones I've attended. So I want to connect this a little bit to last evening's talk. Because to me, there's an unintended consequence of endowments gone haywire related to education, which actually relates to funding of HBCUs and schools that actually have a serious commitment to raising diversity that may be thwarted by this notion of unlimited endowments. And you mentioned universities, but briefly, but I want to focus on it for a second. Two sources that might be helpful. So Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast called I Hate the Ivy League, and he spends a lot of time talking about the difference between Bowdoin and, I'm forgetting the name of the other school that he compares it with. It used to be an all-women's school, but now it's Vassar, of course. And one of the consequences of unlimited endowments of the most elite schools is that endowments attract donors, which is counterintuitive financially, but it just turns out to be the case that people would rather, in large numbers who are extraordinarily wealthy, and I cannot speak from experience here, give more money to schools that don't need it than to give money to schools that actually do. And it turns out that that has really bizarre effects, especially when it interacts with the horrific U.S. News and World Report rating systems of colleges and universities. And one consequence, another source of some relation here, is the Thomas Piketty book on how wealth produces greater returns to capital than to labor. And so these endowments just grow and grow and grow at ways that dramatically outpace any possibility of ever being caught up.
And they're not taxed.
And so it seems to me that this does kind of connect up a little bit to some of the concerns that you raised in your comments last night too. I guess I'll just leave it there as an observation. But I have to say, like, I didn't know this history, and I'm better for knowing it. And thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to always have to have you sitting next to me to tell me how my work, between you and Zach, you help me think that I have some coherence in how I'm thinking about things. But yeah, Gladwell also has, I don't know if it's in the same podcast, but he goes to the president, he's interviewing the president of Stanford. Stanford has like a 40-something, I don't know what it is now, $46 billion endowment. And he says, look, is there ever like enough? Would you ever be like, we're good? Like what if someone from Microsoft comes and they says, we want to give you $20 billion more? And without missing a beat, the president is like, we would be happy to enter that conversation, right? And he's like, but would you ever say, give it to this community, give it to the, right? And so there is this sort of sense.
He literally said that he would take a contribution equal to the UC budget entirely.
Yes.
Right? That he would not at that point say, no, maybe the money should go there instead.
Right.
It was shocking.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm not sure if my temptation is to put all of this into some sort of narrative. And I don't know if this lacks nuance, but what I'm gathering from your talk is that Norman Sugarman kind of held this archetypal role in as the court Jew, right? Like Mordecai. Like he had, he was, in the IRS, regular guy, not destined for anything. And then he heard McCarthy and all of these other guys going on about like secret threats to the American body politic and these people who come in from Poland and Lithuania and these like Eastern European, like he heard this and maybe his coworkers didn't understand what was going on, but he sure did, you know? And he used the power that he had, nobly, wisely, heroically, you know, to protect the Jewish people in America from disaster. Like, and it would have been disaster, because if Jews hadn't been able to raise that money, poor Jews would have died. They would have gone hungry, they would have gone without jobs, they would have gone without medicine. It was life or death. And even those of us who are younger and maybe a little bit more radical can understand that he acted bravely, right? And yet, for all that good intention, he ended up building a system that contributed to this, that created this horrible machine of inequality and corruption and untransparency, where people think that even asking questions like, hey, where did this money come from, is an attack on the Jewish people, which sounds kind of McCarthyist to me, by the way. Threatening you with pulling your tenure, and for that to come from other Jews. So we've managed to recapitulate that very same culture in the Jewish philanthropic world. And it seems like this story, this really detailed story, maybe I'm not picking up on all the details, but the broad picture I'm getting is that even if every single individual involved has the purest intentions, people were fighting tooth and nail not to have unaccountable money, right, in Jewish nonprofits. Even if everyone has completely saintly intentions, you end up, building this unaccountable, release valve for real estate, and wait a couple decades and look where that got us, I wonder if that had any long-term effects on American politics. So if the question you're asking is what does this teach us, I mean, there was a Jewish labor movement, right? There was a real muscular bottom-up organization that poor Jews could, along with other ethnic groups, could express power for themselves without a top-down structure. And instead, why are they gone? This seems to be the story of why those days aren't here anymore. So if you're asking how we can make capitalism fairer and more just, this seems to be a really good case study of, I don't know if I don't think so. And I'm wondering if we're willing to reckon with what that means.
So first of all, thank you for that narrative. I had not thought about it exactly in that arc, and it's really powerful. And I think that one thing you really capture is that I do not believe that Sugarman set out to create some kind of bad or evil or nefarious system, and I don't even believe the system is bad or evil, right? But it is implicated in these larger logics of, a lot of capital accumulation and the profits from that tending not to move to labor, but moving toward more capital, right? So that is the problematic. I don't see it as an unchanging feature necessarily of capitalism. But I guess that one of the kinds of puzzles I always have, in 2008, there was a book that came out called Philanthropy, and there's this sort of socially good, doing well for yourself while doing good for the world, and the idea that sort of capitalism has the solutions to capitalism's problems. And I think that it just demands scrutiny, right? And that there does need to be scrutiny if the answer to the problem is in part keeping capital and keeping wealth so concentrated in the hands of very few people and keeping decision making. And so I actually think that there are some basic reforms that could be made that would make things better, right? I think we could talk about revolutionary changes as well, and I'd be there for that party too, but I think that there are smaller things like when you have a charitable structure, if you have more people involved in the decision-making who are themselves part of the communities that are ostensibly being helped, I think that can be better. I think that if we have a public that understands how philanthropy works and understands, what the benefits are when the Patagonia founder decided to divest himself of, his company, and could really actually ask some questions about that and how it works, not to say it was the best thing or the worst thing, right? I think if we had a more educated public, I think if we had newspapers that brought back their philanthropy beats, which many had had for years and have been defunded, I think that would make it better, right? So I think that there are things that could make it better, and I don't, maybe it's because I'm a historian, I don't just think that these are these never-ending cycles, but there certainly are patterns, and I think that those rules are really hard to break sometimes.
This is excellent, thank you. Curious what role cemeteries played in maintaining cemeteries in the discussion to justify these Jewish endowments?
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because, certainly cemeteries were one of those things that were funded by Landsmannschaften and these very early kinds of Jewish voluntary societies. And, obviously the idea that here's a constituent group that is not going to be able to necessarily continue to pay, but could put money into a fund that would continue to grow, right? So part of and in fact, those who rail against endowments specifically talk about it as the dead hand, right? So it has this sort of funereal kind of feeling to it. And so I'm just thinking through, in the literature and the archives that I reviewed, I didn't see a lot of self-conscious discussion about concern about being able to provision for cemeteries. I think that that was one of the costs of many, many different kinds of community programs and costs. But I think it does, it does sort of fall into this logic, and I think it's part of kind of imagining why there is a purpose to put money in a structure that will continue to do something after one is no longer in this world, I suppose.
Thank you so much for a terrific talk. So I am actually work at a private foundation, so I think about these issues all the time, and it's super interesting to hear your perspective. I'm curious, because you talk to so many different people, were there examples where you talked to either someone who worked in philanthropy or a thought leader where you were like, oh, that's really interesting, that's a bright spot, we should be doing more of this?
Yes, definitely. I mean, so many bright spots, so many of the individuals I talked to who work in philanthropy were just so thoughtful about the enterprise. One of the bright spots was a person who, she's no longer at the San Francisco Jewish Communal Fund, which is the endowment side of the San Francisco Jewish Federation. But when she was there, she really decided that the donor advised fund money was sort of sitting on the sidelines. And she worked to create a number of programs where people would lend out at 0% interest, money that otherwise would be sitting in those funds, through kind of Hebrew free loan type programs. And then if you remember, there was going to be a government shutdown in some year in the Trump years, right? And there were a lot of people who became really concerned about being furloughed and being out of work. And so she was able to sort of pivot and get a lot of commitments that there would be these 0% loans. And she talked to all of these people who held really substantial donor advised funds. And she said, look, your gift will be whatever that loan, whatever that donor advised fund would have accrued in investment income. So that will be a sunk cost in this. And you might not, somebody might default. And if that's the case, then you just have to imagine this as a philanthropic expenditure. But isn't that better than just having this money sit on the side when there are these actual urgent problems in our community? And I thought that that was really ingenious. And, I think that she's no longer in that position.
I'll offer one bright spot. I've been a professional fundraiser for 20 years, and my profession has always had a mantra where we focus on, we call it donor-centric fundraising, because we know it works. And so people like me are meant to talk to donors in terms that they will understand and help them to feel like they are part of the story and they're an important part of the story. And quite recently, not coincidentally, with the rise of more people of color in the profession, there is a new movement called community-centric fundraising, where my own profession is trying to say the donors are not the only person in the story of a nonprofit, and the clients and the staff and other people need a power and a voice here, and even the whole culture of pitting nonprofits against each other. I don't really want to tell you what my organization is doing because you might do it. You know, how do we get over that and treat a community pie and really do community-centric fundraising? And I've got to say, a lot of people in the profession are pretty skeptical because we know we've been built on the needs and the interests of donors. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea of sort of foregrounding community and participation in philanthropy is another one of those bright spots, definitely. And, you know, Ford Foundation did all of this research on participatory grant making. And I think, you know, if I were somebody who had the ears of people who actually can sort of change and make policy for Jewish organizations, that is something that, you know, and I know that some are exploring this, but the idea of, you know, making sure that when an organization is trying to raise money, that there are lots of different stakeholders that are part of the conversation, right? And that it's not just the person who gives the money, and it's not just, you know, the executive or whatever who's trying to sort of say, this is the plan for it, and trying to make that totally seamlessly meet, but that there's an awareness, and I think it starts from understanding that these are public dollars, right? That roughly, let's say 30% of anything that anyone is giving, when they're giving at a high level and when they are therefore part of that, you know, high tax bracket, really are public dollars. And so it's not actually asking too much from a donor to imagine that they are actually part of a public conversation, because the person who works at the institution or the community that is, you know, meant to be benefiting from the program, they're paying part of that 30%. And I think that there is something, you know, powerful in being able to sort of repeat and realize that. So that is a bright spot.
So as I was listening to you, I was thinking about a teaching, and forgive me, I've forgotten the source of the gematria, but there's a gematria, sort of numerical equivalent drawn between two words, that points out that the Hebrew letters of the word mammon, which means money, or I guess maybe Aramaic word, but the word mammon, which means money, is equivalent to the word sulam, which means ladder. Right, and so we go up or down, and I've thought about that a lot, of like what we do as you know, with a tool, right? Money being a benign tool that we use for good or for ill. I think what you've helped me do today, at least, and hopefully a number of us to consider, is, you know, who's on the ladder, right? And where did the ladder come from, and what does it even mean to go up and go down? And so I really want to just celebrate and appreciate the Torah that you've taught and the questions that you've raised. If I can, I want to ask maybe one final question before we wrap up, and that is, you know, are you the Norman Sugarman of today? Who's the Norman Sugarman of today, or the group of Norman Sugarman? Like, who's the one? You're clearly noticing some of the flaws here. And I'm wondering if in your research you've come across people, or even you've come across foundations or donor advised fund holders, where folks are saying, either because they've read your book and they say, whoa, something has to change, or because they've thought of it themselves, and not just the particular employee in San Francisco, and I love that story, but who are thinking structurally about this and maybe how to pivot or reimagine things so that, like, the story we tell 50 years or 100 years from now is maybe not just the same story, but a different story?
It's a great question. So two different kind of entities come to mind. One is an organization called Resource Generation. I don't know if anybody is aware of this organization, but this is an organization that was founded probably now about 15, 20 years ago by young, and it was not meant to be a Jewish organization, but probably at its founding, 80 to 90% of the people in it were Jewish. Many of them identified as queer. And they were people who stood to inherit a large amount of wealth and did not feel like they wanted to participate in the same kind of system of sort of recycling it through this kind of philanthropic mode that they didn't really believe like was redistributing not only the capital but power. And I ended up getting to know some of the folks. This is an organization that continues, and they are really thoughtful. There's a whole sort of like psychological element to what they do. So they have these different affinity groups, and you go through this process of like learning to confront one's own wealth and what it meant and all this stuff. Like as someone who did not grow up with much wealth, was sort of foreign to me. It was really interesting. But they, really are trying to change the narrative, and they go back to their families and to their wealth managers, and they say, if we're going to give to an organization, it needs to be an organization that involves the community in decision making. And if we're going to, give money, we need to be transparent about who we're giving it through, and we're not going to use these, quasi-dark money ways. They meet a lot of resistance, but they're also, actually making a difference. And they have done some really measurably good things, I think. And then the other that comes to mind is actually a tax law professor who I met when I was studying this stuff, who teaches at Boston College. And I worked with her to write some of the history of donor-advised funds, and she is now trying to get past legislation to actually put more regulation on donor-advised funds. And again, it's kind of a wonky thing, but it's a lever. And so she, has worked a little bit with the history and with certainly policy analysts and others. Is it going to pass? Probably not, but it's like this thing, when the other team is shooting enough at your goal, eventually they get a goal. Like, if there's enough energy and awareness that starts to build, and periodically articles about this, and it sort of becomes something more well-known, I think it's possible that it could have legs. And even certain tweaks to it and certain forms of regulation, I think could change the story a little bit and mean that more of this capital has to move. So those are two pieces.
Let's say thank you once again. Our final opportunity to learn with Dr. Berman, at least this Shabbat, will be this evening at 7 o'clock. So join us, please, downstairs in the Beit Midrash for some food and some more Torah. Shabbat Shalom.